Did you know? You could plug Game Boys into a Nintendo 64 DD and use them as controllers with screens. For those unaware, the 64 DD was a disk drive add-on for the Nintendo 64, with internet functionality for downloads and online play, an internal clock so games could track the time and date, and rewritable storage for saving massive amounts of data. All these features combined were meant to expand what a video game could be. The DD had dozens of games in development, but after 2 years of repeated delays, the add-on ended in failure and only sold 15,000 units, with all but 9 of its games ultimately cancelled. One of the games that would have supported Game Boy controllers was DT Blood Masters. The game was half funded by Nintendo and even had the so-called God of Games, Masanobu Endo, in the director's chair. Never heard of him? Endo created the arcade game Xevious, among others, and he was the longtime mentor of Pokemon creator Satoshi Tajiri, who later in life said Pokemon would have never existed without Endo's games inspiring him. Maybe this is the first time you're hearing of Endo, but needless to say, he is a legend, and with him in charge, DT Blood Masters was destined to be something special. DT was announced at Space World 99 as a collectible card game RPG. For simplicity's sake, if you've ever played Pokemon the card game on Game Boy, it would have been kind of like that, but with a very different tone. According to Endo, as far as the feel, it's a mix of playing cards in the neighborhood and world domination set in the near future. There's a secret organization controlling the world economy on one hand, but ordinary people appear too. It has a fully realized story with RPG progression elements. You have your own unit you're the commander of, and you design decks to battle with, so there's also simulation elements. DT Blood Masters also stood out in execution, playable on both the 64 DD and Game Boy. There are actually 2 games in development, one for each system, that you could link together to unlock more features and content. Or, as we touched on earlier, use your Game Boy as a controller with a screen. For example, you could use this in multiplayer so no one else could see the cards in your hand. Up to 4 friends could play together, provided they had 4 Game Boys. You could also download post-release cards and content off the internet, and trade cards with people online. Endo was so into what he was making that he was already talking about sequels on DD and Game Boy. But in late 2000, DT's official website announced that Blood Masters was cancelled and profusely apologized to disappointed fans. Their hand was forced because they had just found out the 64 DD's online service RANnet was getting shut down. Endo publicly considered releasing Blood Masters free to all RANnet users, which implies it was pretty much finished, but in the end decided not to. Instead, he just released a modified version of Game Boy DT as a standalone product. It launched a half year later as DT Lord of Genomes. Pokemon's catchphrase is gotta catch 'em all, but DT's catchphrase was children should not buy this. It was pretty story heavy and similar to Magic the Gathering in terms of gameplay. It spawned a few sequels on mobile, but unfortunately the series always stayed exclusive to Japan. No footage or screenshots of the 64 DD version were ever made public. Nintendo eventually canceled and never released the Game Boy to N64 transfer cable, but they later recycled the idea by letting fans plug Game Boy Advances into their GameCubes. When the Nintendo 64 came out, Miyamoto said it wasn't a complete machine on its own, that its true form is when it's combined with the 64 DD and Game Boy. Unfortunately, we never got a taste of that full experience. According to the 64 DD page on Wikipedia, a total of 61 games were announced for the disk drive, but cancelled in one form or another. Some were downgraded and released on a standard N64 cartridge, a few were upgraded to GameCube, others jumped ship to competing consoles, and a good chunk were cancelled entirely, sometimes when they were almost finished. We spent hundreds of hours researching primary sources in Japanese and found about 10 more games that Wikipedia left off. And also quite a few games on their list that are actually, well, fake. In an attempt to make the definitive 64 disk drive video, we're gonna cover all of them. Every single game, real or not. Most of them we scrounged up new info for, but since there are so many, we'll sum up each one in a couple of minutes, though the more important games will get closer to 5. Your Marios, your Zeldas, Pokemon, we'll get to all the big names soon enough. But first, let's do a less famous one that might have topped them all.
You must eat my flesh and clothe yourself with my fur. You must return to the human world and tell them what you know.
Jungle Emperor Leo was once touted as the biggest Nintendo game of all time. Shigeru Miyamoto's attempt to bring his childhood to life and share it with younger generations with hopes for a sequel already in mind. Information online is pretty scarce and some of it's wrong, so we went looking for more in old Japanese magazines. But before we dig into the games, first we need to touch on the history. Osamu Tezuka is probably the most famous mangaka in all Japan, where he's known as the father of manga. In the early 50s, he authored a series called Jungle Emperor, about lions living in Africa as mankind encroaches on their kingdom. In the 60s, when Miyamoto was a kid, Jungle Emperor was adapted into an anime, and continued to get more adaptations in the following decades, all with divergent stories. In the West, the franchise was renamed to Kimba the White Lion. You might remember seeing commercials when you were a kid. If not, you must have at least heard of The Lion King. Released in 1994, The Lion King drew protests in Japan saying the characters and plot plagiarized Jungle Emperor. Over 400 Japanese artists and animators signed a petition pressuring Disney to give proper credit to Tezuka. Disney denied all claims, but even the actor who voiced Simba initially thought he was in a movie about Kimba.
You must avenge my death, Kimba. I mean, Simba.
All that's to say, Jungle Emperor is a big deal, especially in Japan. Osamu Tezuka died in '89, at which point his son Makoto took over the family business. Makoto was making a new Jungle Emperor movie, and at the same time working with Miyamoto on a video game adaptation that'd be a fresh take on the original tale. Tezuka Productions was creating the game's characters, art direction, music, and sound effects, with Nintendo in charge of everything else, like gameplay and level design. For this project, Miyamoto told the press, I felt it was important that my colleague and artist Mr. Tezuka was the director, while I took a back seat. I embarked on this project to take his father's world that we were all raised on and share it with the younger generation. The game was first announced at Space World 97 with a release date of spring 98, and extremely early gameplay was shown off at the next Space World. In Japanese magazines, Tezuka said he was aiming to make a grand adventure that outshined Mario 64 and really tug at the player's heartstrings. Leo would use his intelligence and strength to fight off enemies and preserve peace in Africa. There'd be jungle settings, ocean areas, and more. Later, Miyamoto said the first few levels were already finished and undergoing polish, but they decided to push back the release date another half year. Total development, including tools and programming, was estimated to be half finished. There's some confusion online if the game was for the Nintendo 64 or the 64 disk drive. Some sites say they don't know, and Wikipedia says different systems on different pages. But according to Miyamoto, it was on a 16 megabyte cartridge, and if things went well, he wanted to make a sequel for the DD. But neither game ended up being made. Makoto Tezuka said he'd like to do some directing, Miyamoto told the press. I grew up reading his father's comics, and they had an incredible influence on my generation. Because of this, I decided to work with Makoto. But later, he decided to give priority to his Jungle Emperor Leo movie project. So we had to bring the game development to a halt. I'm very sad too. I feel sorry for Nintendo fans who are looking forward to this game. Makoto ended up releasing the film in theaters in 1997. A dual launch of the movie and the game together could have been explosive, and a disc drive sequel might have given way to a full-blown series. But sadly, now the best we can hope for is a ROM of those first few levels leaking online someday. Now a best-selling franchise, the original Animal Crossing would have never existed if it wasn't for the disc drive. It was born from the idea of the 64 DD, co-creator Iguchi said in an interview. From there we came up with the concept of a game where you hang out and do stuff with a bunch of people in a single field. We all had little ideas of games we wanted to make, and Animal Crossing became all those ideas piled together. The other co-creator, Nogami, chimed in to agree. Basically, we all just wanted to make something for the 64 disk drive. They were going to make full use of the disk drive's capabilities, like the internal clock and mass amounts of rewritable storage. But when the DD died, they had to downgrade to cartridge. Some ideas got lost in the mix, like RPG-style dungeons, 4 islands based on the seasons, and online functionality. But the internal clock was so important to the core gameplay, for holidays, seasons, and the day-night cycle, that they decided to install battery-powered clocks in every cartridge. Players were also required to use controller packs to increase writable storage. Otherwise, the game couldn't remember all the changes you made to your town. Thanks to all the workarounds, they were still able to salvage a game out of it. They finally released their social simulator in 2001. It was the last N64 game Nintendo ever published. 8 months later, it was re-released on GameCube with some additional content and features that got left out of the cartridge version. Then that version got heavily reworked for the American market, with new items, content, and holidays that make sense to Westerners. The Western localization was so different and high quality, Nintendo translated it back and released it in Japan again. In other words, Animal Crossing ended up as one of the weirdest, latest N64 games with 3 unique versions in Japan alone, thanks in no small part to the death of the 64 DD. Then again, the DD was the only reason Animal Crossing was dreamed up in the first place. It was inspired by the technology itself. Next up is Gendai Desenraku Ultimate War, a turn-based strategy wargame similar to Advance Wars, but much more realistic, using ranged free movement instead of squares on a grid. If you're not familiar with Advance Wars, think Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy Tactics. This is the only known footage of Ultimate War, filmed during its official reveal at Space World 1999. Plus a little more from the year after. And here are some more varied screenshots. Ultimate War was super close to coming out. When the 64 DD opened for pre-orders in late 1999, Ultimate War was announced as 90% complete and scheduled to release just weeks later. The price was set to around $40, which was typical for a disc game since they were about $15 cheaper to manufacture compared to carts. Ultimate War's main campaign would have taken place in the 1990s, with Soviets invading Korea and you as a US Army commander launching a counteroffensive from Japan. There also would have been online multiplayer with up to 4 belligerents. Daisenraku is a long-running series starting in 1985 and is still going today, and they're all very highly regarded. So it's a real shame we never got to play this one, especially since it looks pretty unique compared to the others. After Ultimate War's cancellation, the next one that came out on PC was called a masterpiece by Japanese reviewers, who said you could play it for at least 1,000 hours. The first 6 Final Fantasies had always been on Nintendo consoles. When it came time to make the 7th, Square actually started development on the Super Nintendo. After making a 2D prototype, they took a break to finish up Chrono Trigger, also for SNES. But when they came back to Final Fantasy VII, they decided to make it for the next console generation instead, in 3D. Nintendo sent them development kits, and their earliest experiments were making Cloud, Barret, and Red 13 for the Nintendo 64. Fitting lots of content and especially CGI cutscenes was difficult on cartridge, so using higher capacity 64DD discs was necessary to make the game they envisioned. But after a month or two, it just wasn't working. We made a 2,000 polygon version of Behemoth for the Nintendo 64, director Yoshinori Kitase explained. But when we rendered and animated it, the frame rate was way too low. That was part of the problem with choosing Nintendo. Eventually, producer Sakaguchi casually announced, we're not developing for Nintendo anymore. And the rest is history. Square jumped ship to the PlayStation with its CD-ROMs capable of 10 times more storage than a DD floppy. And Final Fantasy VII grew into the biggest RPG of the generation. The game's hype was so all-encompassing. It almost makes you wonder, could the 64DD have been a success if it just had Final Fantasy VII? Maybe Nintendo's disk drive would have sold millions, a bunch of other games in this video would have gotten finished, and a virtuous cycle might have ensued that made the DD a must-have. Then even more games would have gotten made. Who knows? One thing's for sure though, Final Fantasy VII wouldn't have been the same. On the DD disc, it'd have to be smaller, with fewer cutscenes and less audio. Square probably would have made an entirely different game to account for the smaller storage, not just a crappier version of what they did on the PS1. Doubtless it would have been great either way, and it's fun to imagine the timeline we'd live in now if the series stayed on Nintendo. At this point, you might be wondering, why was Nintendo transitioning to floppies when CD-ROMs stored 10 times more data? Nintendo was fighting a losing battle, but cartridges and floppies still had their advantages. Carts had basically no load times, and enough writable storage to save your in-game progress, but they were expensive to make, and at launch only held 8 megabytes. CDs, on the other hand, were cheap to produce and held over 600 megabytes. But they also had long load times, and no rewritable storage. That's why PS1 games needed memory cards. Some games were a better fit for cartridges, and others for CDs. Final Fantasy couldn't fit on a cart. But if you put something like Zelda on a CD, the load times would make it virtually unplayable as it searched for specific bits of data. .64DD floppy disks were sorta a middle ground. They were 64 megabytes, fairly cheap to produce, with only minimal load times. But there was one thing that made floppies special: mass amounts of rewritable storage. Up to 38 of its 64 megabytes could be used for saving data, equal to 300 PlayStation memory cards. With that, entirely new kinds of games could be made, games that could remember everything, offering experiences impossible on CD or cartridge, like Zelda 64, Mother 3, and Cabbage. You know what? Let's talk about Cabbage right now, actually. One of the most promising 64DD projects, which would have been revolutionary if it ever came out, was a game called Cabbage, a virtual pet simulator taking full advantage of the disk drive's capabilities. Created by an all-star team, led by Shigesato Itoi, creator and director of the Mother series, Tsunekazu Ishihara, founder and president of the Pokemon Company, Satoru Iwata, the genius programmer instrumental in bringing Pokemon to the West and later became president of all Nintendo, and Shigeru Miyamoto, who needs no introduction. Unfortunately, no images or footage were ever released from its years-long development, because they wanted to wait till launch was imminent to make a big splash with the character reveals. The core ideas and mechanics were explained in various magazines and web interviews, so that's what we'll be digging into in the next few minutes. According to Itoi, in a word, it's a breeding game. A game where you can play with your friends. We're flying this game under the radar of Yamauchi, the Nintendo president. That's what's fun about it. There'd be more than one creature, according to Iwata. You'd be breeding 10 different kinds of creatures. And they weren't literal cabbages, by the way. That was just a word Itoi blurted out and everyone seemed to like. Cabbage is just the name for a little creature, Miyamoto explained. You can buy it things, give it food, and raise it. The game uses the 64DD's internal clock, meaning the creature can evolve and change even if you're not playing. You can go out for a few hours and find your creature has totally changed when you get back. But it's inevitable players will have to leave their house. To stop Cabbage from being neglected, a Game Boy cartridge can be used as a basket. You can put Cabbage in his basket and take him with you, using the Game Boy to cater to his every wish. Of course, the Game Boy screen will look different than the 64DD version. When you get home, you can release him back into the virtual world on your TV. While the 64DD will be the major base for playing the game, we want people to download specific stages onto a Game Boy cartridge so they can take it with them on the train to work or school. We've been showing Pikachu because it's good illustrative B-roll, but they said the concept was more like Tamagotchi, the Japanese digital pets that took over the world around the same time as Pokemon, selling over 40 million units from 1996 to 98. But Cabbage actually started development 4 years before Tamagotchi, as a Game Boy game, and it was going to be a lot more ambitious than Tamagotchi. The Dream Team had big plans, like releasing more discs over time that provide your Cabbage with new equipment. Swings, slides, ponds, all kind of stuff that alter the game and how its Cabbages evolved. They were going to set up kiosks at stores, where you'd insert discs to download content and events. You could also download content through 64DD online as cheap microtransactions, and trade Cabbage toys back and forth with your friends. The 64DD's internal clock was so integral. The entire reason the DD even had a clock is because Iwata asked Nintendo to make it a hardware feature specifically for Cabbage. If not for that, there would have never been an Animal Crossing. Iwata was also cooking up systems that would let Cabbage simulate the thoughts and genes of human beings, so the creatures evolved in ways that the creators couldn't anticipate. Talking about how DD hardware works, he said, there can be slightly different content on each disc, even for the same game. The ID number's written onto the disc based on the exact second it's manufactured, and the software can change the algorithm and content of the game based on that ID number. In other words, there's a possibility of playing one-of-a-kind, self-reproducing software without knowing what'll happen next. We're going to use sophisticated programs that mimic the genetics of living things to create characters that develop in unpredictable ways, just like real creatures. The patterns are infinite. We can finally see it all coming together, Itoy proclaimed in 1997. Now that Iwata from HAL Labs has joined us, the tools we're using to make Cabbage are drastically modernizing. Making those tools is the most laborious part, so it looks like that part's finishing up. And it's all moving forward. But by 2000, Cabbage had kinda fizzled out. Miyamoto said the Japanese gaming market was shrinking and Itoy and Ishihara had gotten too busy. Ishihara with Pokemon and Itoy with Mother 3, which, as you'll hear about later, never got finished either, at least not the original version. Miyamoto thought maybe they could eventually pull themselves together and finish Cabbage for GameCube, but that never happened. Years later, he repurposed some of Cabbage's ideas to make Nintendogs, which went on to become the Nintendo DS's second best-selling game of all time. Now, if you're still having trouble imagining what Cabbage would have been like to play, Miyamoto said it would be a lot like Seaman. You know Seaman, right?
Hey kids, want to see something interesting?
One of the strangest games ever made. And yes, that was Seaman mating, and yeah, one of them's dead now. Simply put, it's a bizarre pet sim where you gotta hatch and keep Seaman alive while he asks you countless questions. You answer through a microphone, he learns everything about you, gets philosophical, and goes through the stages of metamorphosis over several real-life weeks. Seaman launched on Dreamcast, but it was almost a 64DD game first. Seaman's creator, Yute Saito, was friends with Miyamoto, and Miyamoto was the first person he ever showed the concept for Seaman, who'd stay personally involved with its development. Miyamoto-san really likes strange and different concepts, Saito explained. So while Seaman was released on Dreamcast, behind the scenes we came very close to choosing to develop the game for the Nintendo 64 DD. Saito was friends with Iwata as well, who years later got Saito working on a 3DS version, but it ended up going unfinished, which led to the old friends falling out. Seaman 3DS was cancelled, and Iwata tragically lost his battle with cancer not long after. Next up is Derby Stallion 64DD. It would have been the 16th entry in the popular horse racing and business simulator franchise that's still going strong today, despite having never left Japan. To be fair, it's always been pretty Japan-centric, and might not appeal to overseas audiences. The way it works is, you don't directly control the actual racing. It's all about acquiring quality steeds, breeding them, training them, gambling, and so on. When it comes time to race, you just watch, and it's a pretty small percentage of your playtime. Similar to DT Blood Masters and Cabbage, you could hook up a Game Boy to continue your campaign on the go, or use your Game Boy as a controller. So in multiplayer, you could do stuff like place bets without opponents seeing what you're doing. The game also presumably would have utilized the 64DD's internet functions to let you race against your pals online, since that had been a feature of the series as far back as the Famicom days. Ultimately, like so many disk drive projects, Derby Stallion 64 did eventually come out, but just as a downgraded version on a standard N64 N64 cartridge, which meant cutting Game Boy support, online play, and probably some additional perks that hadn't been announced yet. It ended up as the second to last N64 game ever released.
You have entered a restricted area.
Every system gets ports, and the 64DD was no exception. Like Unreal, the first-person shooter that took the PC world by storm in '98 and garnered a universal praise with 9 and 10 out of 10 review scores across the board. Calling it an FPS almost doesn't do it justice. It's really more akin to Metroid Prime than your typical shoot-'em-up. To sum up the setting in a single sentence, the player takes control of human prisoner 849, whose transport vessel crashes on an uncharted planet full of alien slaves. Then after all the other crash survivors are murdered, has to make his way to the slaver alien's queen to end her reign in a hail of bullets. The developers at Epic Games said they could have made it for regular old N64, but were aiming for the 64DD to make the console port as good as it could be. Back in those days, ports were often a different and unique experience compared to the original. Doom for PS1 comes to mind with its edited levels and bizarre soundtrack. Or heck, even Doom 64, which diverted so much from the PC original, we don't think you can even call it a port. So it would have been interesting to see how Unreal 64 might have turned out, especially since it never ended up getting ported to any console, ever. In addition to Unreal, Epic Games was bringing one more of their PC titles to Nintendo's disk drive, 7th Legion. 7th Legion was a real-time strategy set in the distant future where overpopulation and dwindling natural resources on Earth leads the government to evacuate a select few, who are called the Chosen, while the rest of humanity is left to perish on our dying planet.
The time came for the ships to depart. Thousands were slaughtered and widespread panic broke out as people realized they had not been chosen in the selection process. Only the smart, powerful, and rich were chosen.
Only the most worthy specimens of the human race would be allowed to leave the planet.
Earth survivors eventually band themselves into 7 legions who fight over what's left. But centuries later, the descendants of the Chosen return to conquer them and take Earth back for themselves. It's a desirable planet once again, you see, because hundreds of years with minimal humans allowed the planet to heal. 7th Legion had 2 single-player campaigns, one where you play as the survivors who have all gathered forces into one legion, the 7th Legion, and in the other campaign you play as the Chosen. Interestingly, the console port was being developed by DMA Design, the studio that later changed its name to Rockstar and made a little game called Grand Theft Auto. The devs were explicit that 7th Legion would not be a straight port, more like a reimagining tailor-made for the 64DD. Sounded promising, but alas, it was not meant to be. One of the few 64DD games that did come out was SimCity 64, the city-building simulation game. Though fairly similar to SimCity 2000, it had a lot of big upgrades. New graphics, street view, individual people and vehicles, being able to see the city at night, and SimCity creator Will Wright being the in-game advisor. Will Wright and Miyamoto are fans of each other in real life, actually. They collaborated on the game, and Wright was even turned into a character in Zelda Link's Awakening. Another game of his, Simcopter 64, was supposed to come out on the disk drive, but never made it.
This is an alert from Central Dispatch. Traffic jam reported. Police request aerial assistance.
Yes, this footage is very rough. It's an early demo, recently acquired by the Video Game History Foundation, so don't think it's what the final game would have looked like. They preserved it so you can play it any time you want, and this is us playing it right now. Originally, it was for the N64, but after this demo was poorly received at E3 '97, they announced it was going to get upgraded to a DD floppy instead. It's based on the 1996 PC game Simcopter, which had 30 cities filled with missions like catching criminals, search and rescue, putting out fires, and dispersing riots. Completing missions gets you points and money for unlocking more missions and bigger, better helicopters. There was other stuff like nuclear explosions and UFOs abducting people, but that's the main gameplay loop. Like SimCity 64, Simcopter 64 would have been more of a reimagining than a straight port, and if you owned both games, you could upload metropolises you made in SimCity into Simcopter. When Copter got cancelled, a chopper was integrated into SimCity 64, but it kinda sucked. Reviewers at the time complained about low frame rates, and there's basically nothing to do. It's probably safe to assume if Simcopter 64 had been its own full-fledged game, the wrinkles could have gotten ironed out with features more fleshed out than what we got tacked onto SimCity. That never happened though, and the game was eventually cancelled in 1999. A later build than what you're seeing now, about 6 months further into development, was obtained by a Redditor in 2022, who said he traded some SNES games for it. He posted video and photos on the N64 subreddit. Then of course people begged him to dump it so everyone could play, at which point he deleted his Reddit and his Twitter accounts and disappeared. So unfortunately, we may never get to play it.
After a vain attempt to rebuild their marriage, Jamie and Gillian separate. Following extensive special military training, Gillian is ordered to report to Neo-Kobe City as a junker, effective today.
After the first Metal Gear, Hideo Kojima made the cyberpunk graphic adventure Snatcher. You play as amnesiac detective Gillian Seed, whose job as a junker takes him across Japan in the 2040s hunting down Snatchers, murderous robots that steal their victims' skin and replace them in society. Kojima's dystopian epic originally released in 1988, which would have made it by far the oldest game ported to the disk drive. We're not so sure this port was even real though. Wikipedia, the 64DD wiki, and various other sites have big lists of every cancelled disk drive game, which are different, but all include Snatcher. Their only source is an issue of video games, The Ultimate Gaming magazine, which says the port's coming, but frankly, it sounds a bit off. For starters, they don't even say how they heard about the port, like a statement from Konami or claiming to know an anonymous insider, so we did some digging to see if it was true. We talked to 4 guys who worked in ports and localizations at Konami and Nintendo back then. They all thought it was fake or never heard of it. We also talked to some 64DD experts and Snatcher superfans. Same thing. Except for that one fishy magazine, there's no source for Snatcher 64DD cited anywhere on the internet, even in Japanese. A similar claim was recently added to the Konami wiki by an anonymous user, but when we started asking about it, the claim was deleted by the wiki's admins. Japanese magazines back then had big lists of announced and upcoming games, and we never saw Snatcher appear on any of them. We also reached out to that fishy magazine's author, Wataru Maruyama, but he never replied. We did manage to speak with the magazine's associate editor, Jeff Higgins, though, who told us Wataru got his information from reading Japanese magazines. That was common back then, by the way. That's how everyone got a lot of their info, from IGN to EGM. But Jeff suspects Snatcher DD was just a rumor to begin with. Quote, I could see them peddling some BS if it meant getting eyes to read their scoops. The thing is, we want it to be true. A Kojima game coming to 64DD could have been awesome, especially since previous ports added new content. But we spent a lot of time digging, and sadly, it's almost certainly fake. So we're gonna have to cross this one off the list of cancelled DD games.
We shouldn't be seen talking, so I'll be brief. Let's go over this one last time. The substitution of the president will be executed the day after tomorrow in New York City. You are not to leave the president's side no matter what.
Next up, it's Hybrid Heaven, Nintendo console's answer to Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear was made by Konami, and Hybrid Heaven was also made by Konami. It was actually a different internal team trying to outdo their co-workers. Partially inspired by Blade Runner, Hybrid Heaven stars a guy named Diaz, a synthetic human hybrid created by an alien race who want to replace Earth's leaders with clones loyal to the extraterrestrials, starting with the President of the United States. But Diaz betrays the aliens and turns the tables on his masters. Besides Snatcher, Hybrid Heaven's the only Konami title on wiki lists of cancelled DD games. Though this one's not especially true either, unfortunately. Even Wikipedia's source, an IGN article, only says it could come out on 64DD. We found an old magazine interview with Konami's N64 development head, Katsuya Nage, who gives a fuller explanation. In fact, this is probably the same interview IGN pulled from back in the day to write their article. Talking about Hybrid Heaven and Konami's DD plans in general, he says they're not announcing anything for the add-on, though they'll consider putting cartridge games on DD if it sells enough units. With the benefit of hindsight, we now know that only 15,000 disc drives were ever sold, which is why Konami never announced a single title. Technically speaking, any N64 game could release on disc, but none of them ever did. As for how Hybrid Heaven turned out when it finally landed on N64, reviewers gave it 7s and 8s, praising its intelligent combat, enigmatic story, and calling it a mix between Metal Gear, Tomb Raider, and Final Fantasy. Maybe if it had been developed specifically for the DD, it could have fared even better, and been the add-on's killer app that it so desperately needed. Shiren the Wanderer 2, Shiren's Castle, and the Oni Invasion is one of the generation's best RPGs that never left Japan. Developed by Chunsoft and published by Nintendo. Though it's part of the Mystery Dungeon franchise, Shiren branched off as its own sub-series starting on Satellaview. You've probably heard of it, but in case you haven't, the Satellaview was a niche add-on for Super Famicom, the 64DD of the previous generation, basically. So naturally, Shiren 2 was announced for the 64 disk drive, but after a couple of years, and for the usual reasons, got downgraded to cartridge. Chunsoft never explained how Shiren planned to use the DD technology. Who knows, maybe it could have had a day-night cycle like its sequels instead of just occasional cutscenes of sundowns. But despite any compromises, the cartridge still managed to hit #1 on Japanese sales charts, and scored 9.5 out of 10 from Famitsu, making you wonder if the DD version would have fared even better. To sum up the story, 10-year-old Shiren's wandering the mountains with his weasel ferret and stops to eat at the village Natane. An Oni tribe attacks, so Shiren's tasked with constructing a defensive castle. That's where you come in. finding stone, iron, and other materials to build fortifications which you find in the dungeons peppered throughout the open world. Tougher dungeons have stronger resources. The game has a fairly unique turn-based battle system, leveling up, and as is typical for the Mystery Dungeon series, the dungeons are semi-randomized for replayability. Once you finish the castle, it's time to fend off the Oni. Unfortunately, Shiren 2 only released in Japan, but thanks to its popularity, fans eventually filled the gap with a translation patch. Animal Eater, without a doubt, was one of the strangest games destined for the disk drive. Brought to you by the guys behind Parappa the Rapper and Jungle Park, with Miyamoto signed on as a producer, Animal Eater defies genre. In pursuit of climbing the tippy top of the food chain, you collect upgrades, level up, mutate, mate, and eat everything in sight. If you can't beat a particular boss, you might need to evolve, or reproduce with different kinds of females and take control of the offspring best equipped for the fight. Though you'll need to beef up the baby before he's ready, of course. Back then, in the early 3D era, other games looked more or less the same, so the devs went for a low-poly cube aesthetic to stand out. At this point, we need to digress for a quick inside baseball history lesson. Animal Eater was a Marigold management game, basically a group of small studios co-funded by Nintendo because the N64 wasn't getting enough third-party support. Fun fact, the word Marigold is a mix between Nintendo's mascot Mario and a seagull, the mascot of Recruit, the other co-founder. Nintendo and Recruit also jointly owned RandNet, the 64DD's online service, with RandNet's name also being a combination of Recruit and Nintendo. Marigold Management's goal was to let creatives make weird games without the pressures of market forces, to bring passion projects to life without worrying so much about profits. Marigold provided advice and mentorship and took care of the small studio's finances, sales, PR, debugging, and other mundane tasks so the creators could focus solely on innovation with no deadlines. The leadership team included Pokemon producer Ishihara and Shiren the Wanderer producer Nakamura. Marigold dissolved in the GameCube era, but before that they worked on DD games like Doshin the Giant, DT Bloodmasters, and Derby Stallion, and for N64, Custom Robo, and Hey You Pikachu. All very unique, and mostly well received. There was real magic over at Marigold. We could do a whole video just about Marigold, but maybe another time. Let's get back to Animal Eater. Like so many other disc games, eventually it got moved over to cartridge. We went looking through Japanese magazine interviews, and according to the designers, the N64 version was 100% complete. Even the instruction manual was a done deal. But one day Miyamoto was like, actually let's not release it. GameCube's coming out, we'll port it over there instead. They said the N64 and the GameCube versions were almost identical, except the resolution and graphics were a little smoother and they could have more animals on screen at once. That N64 build actually leaked online not too long ago. A guy named Martin Nielsen runs the small site NES World. He'd come into possession of some prototype cards, then let them gather dust in a box for 10 years, thinking a lot of it was junk. Finally, in 2021, he took the time to root around in them, and lo and behold, one turned out to be Animal Eater 64. It's now playable online, thanks to Martin. As for the GameCube version, when it finally hit store shelves in 2002, the title was localized as Cubivore, Survival of the Fittest. Critics were confused but positive, mostly giving it 7s in the West and 8s in Japan. Consumers were even more confused, unfortunately, and turned off by the simplistic graphics, so hardly anyone bought it. In recent years, though, people have come around to the idea that it's an overlooked gem. But since the low sales led to few copies being printed, nowadays, Johnny-come-latelys are having to pay $500 as the price for not realizing sooner. Out of the dozens of DD games in development, only 9 ended up releasing. 4 of them were Mario Artist games. Mario Artist Paint Studio was a launch title, and essentially served as a sequel to Mario Paint on Super Nintendo. It also came with some preloaded 3D environments you could explore, edit, and take pictures in, which seemed out of place in a paint game, right? The reason it's there is because Paint Studio started development as a sort of god game called Creator, but Nintendo Japan and Nintendo of America fought over its direction, with Japan emerging victorious and turning it into Mario Paint. The Pokemon Snap exploration mode was left over as the bones of Creator's rotting carcass. But anyway, a couple months after Paint Studio, Mario Artist Talent Studio came out, which was all about making your own characters and playing around with them. A few months later, Mario Artist Communication Kit, which served as a bank to deposit stuff you made in the other entries and share your creations online. And finally, the last game ever released for 64DD, Mario Artist Polygon Studio was a 3D graphics editor that let you make your own polygonal objects. All 4 games work together, but there was also a 5th entry that never came out, Mario Artist Soundmaker, which is exactly what it sounds like on the tin. It's a sound maker. We did a dedicated video on the Artist series a few years ago, so if you're interested, it's got more details on that series. And although they weren't Mario themed, there were a few more Maker games that got cancelled before so much as a screenshot could be made public. DD Sequencer for composing music, Video Jockey Maker for editing video, Game Maker for making your own games, and Graphical Message Maker, which, to be honest, that one probably didn't need to exist anyway. Regardless, DD floppies were the perfect medium for these kind of games, thanks to their 38 megabytes of rewritable storage. Official PS1 memory cards only held 1/8 of a megabyte, meaning DD games could save 300 times more data than PlayStation games. You can save a whole lot of creations on one disc. These kind of games were part of Nintendo's strategy for rethinking what video games could be. Most other games are like little boxed gardens, which Miyamoto likened to Disneylands, full of rides and amusements the developers cooked up to entertain you. But Miyamoto said these maker games were like dropping you in a field with nothing but a stick to play with, and you have to make your own fun. Wait, that sounds kinda boring as hell, doesn't it? No wonder no one bought the DD. He really did say that, but I think what he was trying to say is these games drop you in a field and give you the tools to make your own rides, your own Disneyland. But even still, that sort of thinking only appeals to a niche audience. That said, Mario Artist is the prime example for another more interesting strategy for rethinking the games industry, what Nintendo called the product group concept. Games that could be played on their own, but enhanced when combined with more games. You can play Paint Studio by itself, but you can do more if you have the other Mario artists too. SimCity was at the core of the second product group. Simcopter's attached, of course, but Miyamoto also wanted to expand it with a crazy taxi style of game where you drive around some cities, racing customers to their destinations as fast as possible. Or another where you listen to radio traffic reports so you can plan out the ideal street route to outrun cops chasing you. DD floppies were cheap to produce and easily overwritten, so smaller games and expansions were much more feasible than what was possible on cartridges. Miyamoto said these sorts of budget titles might sell for as little as $5. Different product groups could overlap as well, like letting you turn your drawings into SimCity citizens. That feature did ship actually, but most other ideas fizzled out when the DD failed to find an audience. While Mario and Zelda were transitioning to 3D, Yoshi remained as one of the few holdouts clinging to 2 dimensions. His '97 sequel was originally called Yoshi's Island 64 as a continuation of the best-selling SNES title, but eventually got rebranded as Yoshi's Story. It's on Wikipedia's list of announced 64DD games, with their only source being IGN's response to a reader's email, where IGN claims unnamed Nintendo of America representatives told them in private it'd be on disc, but Nintendo Japan always said Yoshi was a cartridge game, before IGN's mailbag, and after. They even said it was for N64 at Space World 96, literally the same event that Nintendo of America told IGN it was a disc game. Every Japanese magazine preview listed it as an N64 title as well, going back to the very beginning. We're not saying IGN's lying, maybe Nintendo of America did say that, but if so, it appears they were misinformed. Nintendo's other premier 2.5D title, Kirby 64, is a similar story. It's on Wikipedia's list too, but without any citation. We went through tons of Japanese magazines, and again, Kirby was always said to be for the N64. Same goes for the internet. At the very start of development, Miyamoto said it was coming to N64. IGN asked him, "Do you mean 64DD?" And Miyamoto said no, they're making it as a cartridge game, though it is transferable in either format. But that could be said for pretty much any N64 game, they could all be transferred to disc. So it doesn't seem like Kirby was ever meant for DD either. Now, it's possible that there were discussions at Nintendo like, hey, maybe the 64DD will launch in '97 and sell 1 billion units, and by the time Yoshi and Kirby are done, it'll make sense to put them on disc. But we can't find proof either game was ever announced for DD, seriously considered, or made to use the disk drive's capabilities. We can only find evidence to the contrary, so we don't think Yoshi and Kirby really belong on a list of cancelled disc games. Okay, at this point we need to digress. We've been giving Wikipedia a hard time, but we don't want you to get the wrong idea. They're generally a great source of information, and making this video without their DD games list as a springboard would have been even more laborious. Wikipedia gets it right most of the time, but this particular list hasn't been maintained in ages. The only reason we keep bringing it up is because your average gamer who's curious about 64DD games will probably Google and end up on this Wikipedia page and take it at face value. Or the 64DD wikis list, which is mostly the same as Wikipedia's but with no sourcing. So we feel it's appropriate to point out where wikis got it wrong, and add new information where we were able to find it. And hey, we make mistakes too. By the time you're seeing this, there's probably already comments rightfully pointing out errors in this video, or some context that we should have included. Wikipedia covers every subject known to man, so their job's infinitely more difficult to accomplish without ever being wrong. And their contributors do it for free. We spent hundreds of hours on this video and had it proofread by 64DD experts like LuigiBlood and series superfans like Cody Nicolo. But we don't have every Japanese magazine, and we don't know everything. After this video has been seen by thousands of people, it's inevitable some will know more than us about certain subjects. Some of you all might have even worked on some of these cancelled games. So please feel free to point out errors in the comments, or if your information's of a more sensitive nature, you can always contact us privately through Twitter. In summary, Wikipedia is a great, accessible resource, but it's not a primary source. There's always more information than what's on Wiki, and no one can be right 100% of the time. That applies to Wikipedia, IGN, and us too. Okay, on to the next game. Fin was a dolphin bird pet sim. Think of him like a simpler, kid-friendly seaman. That game was rated T for teen, but Fin's E for everyone. It had a 24-hour real-time day-night cycle, weather, and made use of a microphone so you could talk to him. Though he couldn't talk back like Seaman. Not in human words anyway. Fin's planet, Teo, had a few different environments occasionally populated by alien creatures. You can feed Fin and take care of his other needs like thirst and happiness, but he's more than capable of foraging his own food and taking care of himself. It's really more like a wildlife observation game than a survivalist pet sim. He'll never drop dead from fatigue, get mated to death, or anything like that. But it's fun to hang out with him, especially with the voice interactivity, and even more so for a kid in the 90s. You might be surprised to hear this game did come out, as Fin on Teo, The Magic Planet, which released only on PC in 1996. It was supposed to land on Nintendo's disk drive a couple years later, but never did. The publishers at Fujitsu were really trying to make Fin the next big thing. They released a deluxe edition with added content, all kinds of different toys and merch, and even a Japanese TV show, though it never got past the pilot episode. Overall, the game seems to have been a moderate success, selling around 500,000 copies. But you'll never guess who the lead producer was. Believe it or not, it was Makoto Tezuka, the Jungle Emperor guy. Fin was the only game he ever finished. Afterwards, he went back to his movies. Teo 64 DD was reportedly going to be very different than the PC editions, but details on how exactly were scant. If you want to hear more about the original release, check out LGR's channel. He's got a great 20-minute review about Fin for PC, a game that otherwise has mostly been forgotten nowadays. It's also free to download on abandonware sites if you want to play it yourself. A 64DD version of Super Mario 64 was exhibited at Space World 96 and shown off in lots of magazines, but never came out. Fans and gaming press alike were left speculating about what exactly the game was. An expansion for the original? Maybe an enhanced remaster? Almost 2 decades of theories were finally put to rest in 2014, when a French N64 collector named Jimmy130 found out a long-lost copy was sitting in a second-hand shop in Japan. God only knows how it got there. The shop seemingly had no idea the kind of treasure they had, so when they listed it on Yahoo Auctions, Jimmy bought it. It's primarily the same as the cartridge release, though it's got a few slight differences. You might have noticed the first one already, the music. Here's a couple comparisons. Cart versus disc. Due to the disc format, there's occasional brief load times. And also some random photos in the internal data, presumably used for testing, like selfies of Atsushi Watanabe, who worked at Nintendo's Integrated Research and Development Division. But there's no extra levels or enhanced graphics, nothing like that. And the music's actually the same as the original, just recompiled with a different sound engine. It's not like Nintendo went through the trouble of recomposing it. So, disappointingly, it looks like it was just a tech demo all along, never meant to become an actual product, and thus, not technically a cancelled game. Folks thought it was for decades though, and some old rumors are still up on the internet, so we thought we'd include it on our list. And heck, it's just an interesting piece of 64DD history. You'll be happy to hear the ROM's been dumped, so nowadays anyone can download Super Mario 64 DD and play it for themselves. That's Super Mario 128, not Super Mario 64 2. They were 2 different projects, though they sometimes get conflated. 128 was a GameCube tech demo shown off at Space World 2000 that eventually kinda turned into Mario Galaxy and Pikmin. Mario 64 2 was for 64DD, so that's the one we're gonna dig into. It was the last game Miyamoto ever directed, or at least it would have been, if he ever finished it. As soon as he completed the first game, he said, "I couldn't put everything into Super Mario 64 that I really wanted, so we've decided to continue working toward a sequel, which will take about 1.5 years at least." Later adding, the first game is only using about 60% of the N64's hardware power, you see. There's really so much more we could do, so we decided to save those ideas for next time. Luigi was famously cut from Mario 64, and bringing him back was a core component of the sequel. But not for multiplayer, it'd be more like Resident Evil 0 or Pikmin 2, where you control both or switch between Mario and Luigi for puzzle solving and other utilities left up to our imaginations. Yoshi also got cut from the original, except for a post-game cameo, and Japanese magazines reported he'd be returning in a more prominent role, though Miyamoto never confirmed that detail. I'm changing the gameplay system, adding more enemies and retooling the display and graphics, he teased months later. Last time I only designed for a cartridge, but next time I will take advantage of the potential of the 64DD. I plan to utilize the 64DD's read and write functions to create a new type of game. After a couple of years, he said the game was half finished and he had a prototype with Mario and Luigi running around on his desk. But he didn't have time to focus on it because he was too busy with Zelda 64. Miyamoto promised that once Zelda was done, he'd refocus on his favorite plumber. But he was overseeing about 10 games at once as producer and supervisor, and having a hard time being everywhere at once. Yoshi's Story got delayed, so he moved developers over there to finish it up quicker, but that caused Zelda to get delayed, and then in turn, got Mario delayed. Meanwhile, he was also producing Star Fox, Mario Kart, Mario Artist, Pokemon Snap, F-Zero, Mario RPG 2, Smash Bros, and more. Nintendo had laid too much on his lap, more than one man could handle. But still, development continued, with him later saying his team was also experimenting with 4-player split screen, and insiders telling press the other two characters were Peach and Toad. It's a long, complicated mess of a story. We just gave you the cliff notes, but if you want the longer version, we did a dedicated video on Mario 128 and 64-2 a few years ago. To wrap up this summary though, Miyamoto's Tower of Cards eventually collapsed, resulting in 64-2 quietly getting cancelled, along with a lot of other games you're hearing about in this video. Miyamoto stayed on as series producer, but gave the director's chair to Yoshiaki Koizumi, who went on to make the Mario 128 tech demo, Sunshine, Galaxy, and is still directing 3D Mario to this day. No footage or screenshots were ever made public of 64-2. And for fans hoping the prototype will leak online someday, it remains probably the holiest of 64DD holy grails. We debunked Yoshi's Story being a 64DD game earlier, but while we were reading up on Mario 64-2, we stumbled over an interesting tease from Miyamoto. Talking 1 year after Yoshi's Story was already out, he says they're now experimenting with a DD Yoshi game, which the interviewers interpret to mean Yoshi's Story 2 is in the works, although it also could have been a disc expansion for the original. But the way things turned out, Yoshi didn't get another game until 2004 on the Game Boy Advance. I don't know if it's accurate to call these Yoshi 64DD experiments a cancelled game exactly, but still, it's interesting to learn the disk drive could have not only had Mario 2, but Yoshi 2 as well. If it did come out, it might have been the only 2D platformer in the add-on's entire library. Metal Slader Glory 2 isn't on any disk drive game lists, but it should be. This one's not appealing in the sense you'd necessarily want to play it, but because it's bizarre and of extreme historical significance. You'll see what we mean, but before we get to the DD, you'll need some background on the first game. In 1987, HAL Laboratory artist Yoshimiru Hoshi was putting together a presentation at his desk when Satoru Iwata walked by and was like, "Wow, I've never seen graphics that good. Look at those characters. You don't even need to make a presentation, I hereby approve your game. In fact, I'm going to help you make it." Iwata served as both programmer and producer until the game was finally completed 4 years later. It's famous for being one of the most expensive Famicom games of its time, Iwata recalled with a laugh. It's actually kind of amazing we stuck to it, persevered, and eventually released it. But from a management perspective, it was a mistake. At 8 megabytes, the cartridge was insanely huge for a Famicom game. That's the same size as Mario 64 a couple console generations later. Unfortunately, HAL went bankrupt trying to promote it. Nintendo said they'd bail them out, but only if Iwata was promoted to become HAL's new president. HAL accepted. A decade later, Iwata became president of Nintendo itself. All Nintendo history in the years since would have been a lot different, and probably worse, if it wasn't for Metal Slader Glory. As for the game itself, it's a text-based adventure set in 2062, not long after a great war between space colonies. The protagonists sort of accidentally come into possession of a Metal Slader Gundam, which houses a secret message warning the Earth is in danger. They investigate and find out the space colony war was a cover-up, and the real war was between colonists and aliens. Not only that, but the aliens are capable of disguising themselves as humans, and have infiltrated our government. We won't spoil the rest. A fan translation came out in 2018 if you want to experience it yourself. Yoshimiru wanted to make a sequel for 64DD and actually wrote a book about it in 2013 called The Truth Behind the Phantom Game Project. It took a while to get a copy and have it translated, but it was worth the trouble. Honestly, we wish every scrapped project got a book like this. It says in 1997, Yoshimiru pitched a prequel starring Yayoi Kisaragi, who played a bit part as a waitress and secret soldier in the first game. This prequel takes place 1 year earlier and also features her 4 sisters, all between the ages 12 and 19, each with lengthy bios detailing their unique personalities. It's a girls' game, Yoshimiru writes. The title would have been The 5 Kisaragi Sisters, spread out over 5 discs, with each sub-story being about 3 hours long and centered around a different sister. They'd release a few months apart and use the 64DD to its fullest potential. Rewritable storage, voice acting, and using all that disk space for several novels worth of dialogue. Every disc could be played on its own, but your save data carried over if you played them all, with incentives to replay again and again. But the further you get into Yoshimiru's book, the more you realize it's not exactly for girls. It's actually what the Japanese call a gal's game. If you're not familiar, that means it's a game starring attractive young girls with teenage boys as its target audience. For example, Mitsuke, the 17-year-old. She does have a distinct backstory and personality, but the first sentence of her bio says she's a big-breasted girl with a 96F bra size. Double exclamation marks. Now, the first game did have a flirty male lead, and occasionally panty shots and stuff like that, but it was all in service to a sci-fi narrative. I'd like to think the 64DD prequel would have had a riveting story of its own, but the book doesn't get into any of that at all. It's only interested in telling us about the girls, and saying again and again, making it very clear that this is a gal's game. We found Yoshimiru on Twitter and asked, so what is the story? He said it's set in a Yokohama school where you build relationships with the 5 sisters. We inquired further, asking if it ultimately lead to science fiction like the first game. His answer? There was nothing sci-fi about it. Then he made an uwu face. I almost can't believe that this was the pitch to follow up the most advanced game ever released for Famicom. So anyways, about that pitch, Yoshimiru took everything you'd just seen and showed it to Nintendo, who said, actually the 64DD is getting delayed and things are kinda uncertain right now. So we're sorry to say, maybe this isn't the best time to begin development. In his book, Yoshimiru admits, in hindsight, the gal's angle might have been a problem too. Hell told him that since the prequel wasn't going to happen, they'd let him port the first game to Super Famicom instead. Yoshimuro took that ball and ran with it, and with a small team, made more than a port. It was a full remake with better graphics and some R-rated dialogue cut from the original. Metal Slayer Glory, Director's Cut, came out in late 2000. It was the last game ever released for the Super Famicom. Yoshimuro has made other stuff in his career, but he considers Metal Slayer Glory his life's work. In the decades since, he's made more Slayer manga, books, a drama CD, toys, and never stopped dreaming about one more playable experience. Currently, he's hoping to make it a virtual reality game. Well, we're almost an hour in, and we've barely covered half the games. We haven't even gotten to some of the big ones like Pokemon, Zelda, Donkey Kong, and Mother 3. Honestly, this video turned out twice as long as we thought it'd be when we started. So after we tie up some loose ends with magazines and interviewees, we'll be back soon with this video's part 2. And if you're looking for something to watch right now, check out our video about every cancelled GameCube game. I'm Tony from Hartford Games. I guest narrated today's video, but I've been covering the 64DD almost 15 years now on my own channel. I'll throw a bunch of the videos into a playlist and click the thing on the right if you want to see them. Special thanks to our translator Jacob, Eurasia M for footage capture, and all the folks who helped make this video possible. Especially 64DD expert LuigiBlood for consulting and proofreading. And thank you for watching. See you next time.